If this fails, okay, you will get a line pressure loss.
Not like having low blood pressure.
Low blood pressure, yes. I like having low blood pressure. It's also what we call a worm track or channels. These are called accumulator pistons. What these do is when a component becomes applied, it needs to soften up the shift because you got approximately anywhere at average speed where your foot is on the throttle. What you have is you'll have anywhere between 120 to 300 psi of pressure going to that component. And it needs that amount of pressure to hold on. Unfortunately, you don't want all that pressure coming on all at once. So what these do is these cushion that apply. What you have is you have a set of springs, a piston, and pressure goes and splits off into two different directions. One goes to the component, either a clutch pack or a band, okay, and the other side goes to this accumulator. And what this does is when the pressure comes in on the other side, it cushions down until it is completely compressed. And when it completely compressed, that component then can fully apply. If you got full pressure down to that component, as soon as it would shift into that certain gear, it would knock your head off. This is called the channel plate or a chain cover. We call it a channel plate because you got the channels on one side. It's also a chain cover because it covers the chain. As you can see, this chain is pretty worn out. Usually if you can go up at least half of a thumbnail, it'll tell you whether or not this chain is worn out. As you can see, I can go way beyond half a thumbnail. This chain is worn out. What this will also do is it'll start to cause a rattle. It'll go back up and forth, and it'll start beating the heck out of itself back up in here. You'll also hear a noise when you're going into gear. Sound like a chain wearing out.
Taking up the slack.
A rattling sound. It's usually a deadened rattling sound because it's also submerged in oil. This is a rear support. It's called a rear support because it helps to support the rear sprocket, as you can see. Okay. It also has a small needle bearing inside of there that helps to support this main shaft. You see I have another thrust washer here. This is called a band strut. Helps to hold the band in place. Here's your overdrive band, which I showed you earlier. You have an overdrive servo. The overdrive servo piston comes in through the side of the case and applies the overdrive band. See another thrust washer. This is what we call a one-way clutch, a sprag, or a roller clutch. Okay, they call this a sprag because what you have inside of it is a set of what we call dogs. Okay, they lean one way and allow it to spin one direction. When they go to cock the other direction, they lock down. It's called a one-way clutch. A one-way clutch. On the other end, what you'll have is, I'll show you in a couple of seconds, but you'll have it's called the spring and roller set. And what you'll have is a set of rollers with springs on it. Basically does the same thing. Okay. As you can see, it spins one direction, locks the other. The reason they use these is so that way when when one component needs to come on and it needs to go off, when you go to shift to another gear, what you end up doing is instead of trying to control that other clutch from coming off immediately when the other one is supposed to come on, It takes quite a bit of doing. So what they do is they run a one-way clutch. That way one component, as this you can see, this is your forward clutch that sits right here. When this component comes on and it applies, it can stay on. When it needs to go off, instead of having to go off when the next component comes on, what this does is it overruns and it starts to speed over. Okay? That way you don't have to try to release one clutch and try to apply another one at the same time. In other words, what happens is a lot of times you'll have what's called an overlap or a bind-up. Okay? When you get a bind-up is when the back tires want to lock up, or in this case, the front-wheel drive, the front tires would want to lock up in that situation. You can either get a bind-up, or if they don't apply and release exactly the same time, you may because it's called a flare. Okay? And that's because one component released too soon before the other component had the chance to apply.